In the autumn of 1843, the valleys and ridges of northern Alabama still held secrets untold by white settlers. The rugged landscape of the Cumberland Plateau, with its dense forests and steep ravines, had become both sanctuary and snare for one man whose name would soon be spoken with unease by hunters, overseers, and slave catchers alike. This is the account of Elias Moore, a man who escaped bondage only to become something far more terrifying than his former masters could have imagined. The first documented mention of Elias Moore appears in the records of the Harlow Plantation, situated roughly 20 miles northeast of Huntsville in the Tennessee Valley District. Charles Harlow, a wealthy landowner who had migrated from Georgia to Alabama in the 1820s, owned more than 40 enslaved persons, including a young man listed simply as Eli, age 22, field hand. According to plantation ledgers preserved in the Madison County Historical Society archives, Eli had earned reputation as rebellious and had attempted escape twice before his 23rd birthday. The Harlow Plantation lay in the looming shadow of the southern ridges of the Cumberland Plateau, where the land rose sharply from the fertile valley. To the east, the mountains stood like watchmen, their forested slopes offering both peril and possibility. For someone contemplating escape from bondage, those wilderness highlands represented perhaps the only real chance. North lay Tennessee, still bound to its own plantation economy. West lay the deep, unpredictable Tennessee River. South stretched the even more unforgiving plantation belt of central Alabama. The mountains, though harsh, at least held no overseers and no chains. It was on the night of October 11, 1843, during an unseasonably cold autumn storm, that Elias Moore vanished from the Harlow Plantation for the third and final time. Unlike his earlier attempts, this escape bore signs of careful, deliberate planning. The Overseer's Journal, now housed in the Alabama Department of Archives and History, recorded that Moore had taken a wool blanket, a butcher's knife used for hogs, and roughly 2 weeks of dried provisions from the smokehouse. What makes Moore's escape remarkable was not simply that he slipped away unseen, but that he chose not to travel north toward the Free States as most fugitives did. Instead, evidence strongly suggests he ventured deeper into the uncharted, rugged terrain of northeastern Alabama, into the wilderness few white settlers dared to penetrate. The first indication of Moore's transformation came 3 months after his disappearance, in January of 1844. A hunter named Daniel Wicker reported to the sheriff of Jackson County that he had encountered a wild-looking Negro man while tracking deer near what is now Guntersville Lake. According to Wicker's written statement preserved in county records, the man was dressed in animal hides and carried both a crude spear and a knife. The encounter ended with the stranger vanishing into thick underbrush before Wicker could speak or follow him. In the months to come, similar reports filtered in from trappers, hunters, and the few settlers stubborn enough to build homes in the most remote valleys of the region. The figure was always described the same way: a tall black man with a distinctive scar slashing down his left cheek, matching the plantation's documented physical description of Elias Moore, clad in skins and demonstrating uncanny woodcraft. At first, these sightings generated curiosity more than fear, but curiosity turned swiftly to dread. In April of 1844, a small hunting party led by Robert Kincaid failed to return to their settlement near present-day Scottsboro. When a search party found their abandoned camp, they discovered signs of violent struggle and 3 of the 4 men missing. The lone survivor, Henry Lyle, was found hiding in a hollowed tree nearly a mile away, trembling and incoherent. Lyle's account, recorded by the county magistrate, described an attack by a mountain shadow, a Negro devil that moved through the trees like wind, striking with terrifying speed and precision. He claimed the attacker killed his companions silently, leaving no chance for them to fight back.
Authorities initially dismissed Lyle's description as the panicked invention of a traumatized man who had witnessed some more ordinary tragedy. But when more reports began to resemble his account, the dismissal grew harder to maintain. Throughout the summer and fall of 1844, isolated homesteads reported mysterious thefts, not of money or valuables, but of practical necessities, tools, cooking pots, knives, axes, and clothing. The most unsettling detail was that these thefts occurred while the occupants slept, with no signs of forced entry. People woke to find their doors still barred from the inside, yet items missing and faint tracks disappearing into the woods. By December, the mysterious figure in the mountains had acquired a name whispered with a mixture of fear and grim fascination. The Ridge Phantom. Settlers claimed this was no mere fugitive, but a creature forged by the wilderness itself, able to move silently, survive the bitter winters, and harbor a deep hatred for white hunters and slave catchers. Newspaper accounts from the Huntsville Democrat, now preserved on microfilm in the state archives, dismissed these stories as superstition, though they reluctantly acknowledged that some Negro fugitive appears to be residing as a savage among the northeastern highlands. The Ridge Phantom might have remained nothing more than a local curiosity, an unsettling tale traded at taverns and campfires, had it not been for the events of February 18, 1845. A slave-catching expedition led by Silas Murdoch, a notorious hunter of fugitives with a reputation for brutality, ventured into the mountains with the sole purpose of capturing Elias Moore. Several plantation owners, anxious that Moore's freedom might embolden their own enslaved workers, had pooled money to hire Murdoch. He arrived with 6 men and 4 trained tracking dogs. According to the only survivor, Aaron Pike, the group tracked a set of prints deep into a narrow valley on the second day. As darkness thickened, they set camp near a shallow stream. Shortly past midnight, the dogs began to growl, then fell silent. What followed, Pike insisted, was a slaughter executed with almost military precision. Shadows moved between trees. Men vanished into darkness without a cry. By dawn, Pike alone remained alive, having escaped only by stumbling into the icy creek and being swept downstream. He later told authorities that as he clung to a log in the water, he saw a tall figure standing on the bank, watching him. "Could have killed me with the bow he carried," Pike whispered, "but he let the water take me, like he wanted me to tell the tale."
The authorities could no longer pretend that nothing was happening. The deaths of 5 white men, especially men employed in a legally sanctioned pursuit of property, demanded swift action. In March of 1845, Governor Benjamin Fitzpatrick authorized a militia expedition into the mountain region to capture or kill the fugitive now openly identified in official correspondence as Elias Moore. The expedition consisted of 40 armed men, led by Captain Ezra Ballard, a seasoned officer known for his discipline, but not for his familiarity with the wilderness. Their journals, preserved in fragments, described their frustration almost immediately. They searched for 3 weeks, combing the winding ridges and deep ravines, and found only signs that someone was watching them. They discovered abandoned camps, the ashes of fires still warm. They found caches of stolen goods hidden in narrow caves, carefully organized, indicating a long-term survival system rather than an aimless fugitive. Once, a soldier reported seeing a figure standing at the crest of a ridge, watching from a distance. By the time they attempted to pursue, the figure had vanished like a ghost slipping into the trees. On the 18th day, the militia made the discovery that forever sealed Moore's place in local folklore. Deep in an isolated valley, shielded by steep stone walls and thick vegetation, they found what appeared to be Moore's primary encampment. It was unlike anything they expected. Built partially into the side of a cliff and using a natural cave as its foundation, the structure included wooden extensions, a crude thatched roof, and a fortified entryway.
The craftsmanship suggested not only survival, but ingenuity. Moore had not been living like an animal. He had created a hidden home. Inside the encampment, they found an arsenal, 3 rifles with ammunition, multiple handmade knives, several spears, and a bow with arrows of remarkable precision. They also found the personal belongings of at least 7 men who had gone missing in the region over the previous year. But most disturbing of all was a journal. Bound in animal hide and filled with pages of stolen paper, the journal revealed a startling truth. Elias Moore could read and write, and he possessed both intelligence and seething hatred. He wrote of his tortured years on the Harlow plantation, describing in vivid detail the abuses he had endured and witnessed.
He wrote of the beatings, the chains, and the overseer's cruelty. He recounted his earlier escapes and the punishments that followed. And then he wrote of the mountains. "In these heights I have become what they feared," he wrote, "no longer a slave, but a shadow they cannot command. What mercy did they show? So shall I show the same." The journal also revealed that Moore had not been entirely alone. He spoke of meeting at least 2 other fugitives in the wilderness, though he never named them. He referred to them only as brothers in bondage, men who had chosen the mountains as their path to freedom. The wording suggested a primitive but functioning network. Information shared, food exchanged, skills taught, and warnings delivered when danger approached. Captain Ballard's militia spent another week searching for Moore and his companions, but found no trace of them. It was clear that the moment Moore realized the mountains were being combed, he abandoned his encampment and moved deeper into the wilderness. Ballard returned to Huntsville with the journal and several artifacts, but without the man he had been ordered to capture. The Ridge Phantom's activities diminished after the militia expedition. For most of 1845, sightings were rare, and thefts tapered off. Some settlers began to speculate that Moore had finally fled northward or died in the harsh wilderness. But the mountains held their silence, and winter was coming. Many hoped the cold would finish what the militia could not. They were wrong. The quiet ended abruptly and violently in January of 1846. On the night of January 7th, Charles Harlow, Moore's former master, was found dead in his study. The circumstances were bizarre and chilling. The house was locked from the inside. No items were stolen. The only wound on Harlow's body was a single handcrafted arrow driven through his heart. On the desk lay a piece of folded paper. Written in a careful and deliberate hand were the words, "Justice comes even to the mighty. Remember Elias Moore." The murder of such a prominent plantation owner in his own fortified home sent shockwaves rippling through the region. Panic spread. Rumors took on new ferocity. Some whispered that Moore had become something more than a man, something elemental, something shaped by the mountains themselves. A second expedition was formed within days, larger, better armed, and commanded by Major Victor Langston, a hardened military man who scoffed at superstitions but understood the importance of restoring order. 60 armed men accompanied him, along with several professional trackers from Tennessee. Their orders were blunt: do not take the fugitive alive. The expedition set out on January 20th, 1846, confident that with their superior numbers and the stripped winter terrain, they would find and kill Moore. Instead, they staggered back 2 weeks later with 17 men lost. The survivors spoke of terror inflicted with surgical precision. Moore and his unnamed allies used the mountains as weapons. They laid false trails. They manipulated echoes. They separated soldiers into smaller groups, ambushing them from above or from behind.
They struck at night, when cold and exhaustion made even trained men vulnerable. And every attack was silent, deadly, efficient, merciless. One account described 6 militiamen making camp in what they believed was a secure location, only to awaken and find 2 men missing and a message carved into a nearby tree. You hunt a man who learned to hunt by watching you. Major Langston, after losing more than a quarter of his force without ever once confirming a direct sighting of Moore, ordered a retreat. His report to Governor Fitzpatrick read, "We face not a fugitive, but a phantom who commands these mountains. My men believe death waits in every shadow, and I can no longer guarantee their lives in this futile pursuit." For the next 18 months, the legend of the Ridge Phantom grew, even as direct attacks diminished. Travelers reported seeing crude warnings carved into tree trunks. Slave catchers refused assignments that would take them near the northeastern highlands. Cherokee people remaining in the region spoke quietly of a protective spirit avenging the suffering of the oppressed. And while no records directly link Moore to the sudden spike in successful escapes from plantations in northern Alabama, nearly every oral history from the region suggests that fugitives traveling through the mountains did not travel alone.
The last confirmed sighting of Elias Moore came in August of 1847. A government surveying team working near what is now the Alabama-Georgia border encountered a lone man approaching them from the tree line. According to their official account, the man carried no visible weapons and moved calmly, with the confidence of someone unafraid of who might be watching. The party's leader, Jonathan Pike, later wrote that the man identified himself as Elias Moore and spoke to them for nearly an hour. Pike described Moore as weathered, but not broken by his years in the wilderness. His hair had grown long, his frame hardened by survival, his eyes sharp as a hawk's. Pike noted something else, too. Moore's voice held none of the fearful hesitation common among fugitives. He spoke like a free man. When the surveyors asked him what he intended to do next, Moore reportedly gazed toward the distant northern ridges and said, "I have made these mountains remember me. Now I must find what true freedom means." Whether he actually escaped north, as his words suggested, remains unknown. After that meeting, no confirmed sightings or confrontations involving Moore appear in historical records. He disappeared as quietly as he had once slipped from the Harlow plantation, leaving behind only speculation, fractured memories, and fear that lingered long after his shadow vanished. But the legend refused to die. Throughout the 1850s, enslaved communities in northern Alabama whispered stories of the Ridge Phantom, who lived free among the high forests and punished cruel masters. Plantation owners reported that such stories emboldened their enslaved workers, making them defiant or daring them to escape. One overseer complained that even the mention of that name is enough to unsettle the men. When Union forces occupied parts of northern Alabama during the Civil War, some officers recorded hearing these tales from both white and black residents. A Union captain named James Woodson wrote in his 1864 journal that an elderly Cherokee man claimed to have sheltered Moore shortly before he left the region for good. According to this account, Moore did not die in the mountains. Instead, he slipped north under cover of winter storms and ultimately reached Canada. The historical record offers no confirmation, but it offers just enough possibility to keep the legend alive. In fact, a compelling piece of evidence was discovered in the 1890s, a letter written in May 1848 by a Quaker abolitionist in Pennsylvania, now held in the Alabama Department of Archives and History. The letter mentions a remarkable man recently arrived from the southern wilderness, calling himself Elias, formerly enslaved in Alabama,
who lived as a wild man in the mountain forests. The letter describes him as bearing scars, physical and emotional, but possessing an intelligence and quiet dignity that left a deep impression on those he met. It also states that Elias planned to travel on to Canada, fearing capture under the new fugitive slave laws. The most striking detail in the letter is this line: "He carries with him a small journal bound in hide, written in a steady, educated hand." If true, this journal could only have been the same one found in his abandoned mountain encampment, or perhaps the second journal he began after abandoning the first. But no such journal has ever been found in Canada or anywhere else.
If Moore reached Canada, he likely adopted a new identity, just as countless other fugitives did. The trail grows cold after the letter, leaving scholars to debate whether the man who haunted the Alabama highlands ever truly found peace. Regardless of his fate, the impact of his 4 years as the Ridge Phantom rippled through the region long after he vanished. Plantation records from 1844 through 1848 show a noticeable drop in severe punishments in communities close to the mountains. Some owners admitted privately to moderating their treatment of the enslaved out of fear. The threat did not need to be real. It only needed to be believed. One plantation owner wrote to his brother in Georgia, "We must tread lightly, for there is a devil in these hills who has declared himself judge of cruelty." The fear extended beyond plantations. Caleb Winters, a man who served on a slave patrol in Jackson County, later wrote in his memoir, published posthumously in 1879, "No man wished to ride too near the ridges after dark. We all knew what happened to Murdoch's men. Whether it was Indians, Panthers, or the devil himself, we rode in pairs and never loudly." The winter of 1847 had been especially harsh. Snow covered the high country, temperatures dropped dangerously low, and even the strongest hunters struggled to survive. Many believed Moore used that winter as cover to vanish from the region. Yet not all agreed. Some insisted he died in a cave, frozen but unbowed. Others believed he never left, that he grew old in the mountains and simply learned to avoid all contact. The most curious tale came from a 97-year-old woman named Sarah Doyle, interviewed in 1969. She claimed her grandfather had been one of the 2 unnamed fugitives Moore mentioned in his journal. According to Doyle, her grandfather said Moore taught him everything: how to move undetected through the forest, how to find water in winter, how to hunt without firing a gun. They lived together for almost 2 years, becoming something like brothers. Doyle's grandfather eventually left the mountains after the Civil War, married, and began a new life. But Moore, he said, was restless. Samuel, he never wanted a house, Doyle recalled her grandfather saying. He belonged to the trees. Archaeological investigations in the 1990s uncovered a small shelter built under a rock overhang in the Cumberland Plateau region. Dr. Ann Carrington, who led the excavation, found charcoal, handmade tools, and, most intriguingly, a metal button used on clothing issued at the Harlow plantation during the 1840s. Though not conclusive proof, the evidence strongly suggested the shelter had belonged to Moore or one of his companions. By the early 20th century, the legend began to fade from formal history, but lived on in the memories of black families across the region. Church records from a small African Methodist Episcopal congregation near Scottsboro described a yearly observance on January 7th, Remembrance Day, honoring the night when justice visited the Harlow household. Even as the mountains filled with logging trails, mines, and later highways, there remained pockets of forest unchanged since Moore walked them.
And in these deep valleys, hikers occasionally reported strange sensations, as if eyes were watching from the trees, as if a shadow moved where no shadow should be. Park rangers often teased tourists about the Ridge Phantom, but even they admitted the mountains held secrets. One ranger said, "Up here, as the light dies, you realize how easy it would have been for one man to disappear, or to appear where you least expect him."
Throughout the early decades of the 20th century, as memories of slavery retreated into the shadows of living memory, the story of Elias Moore drifted between whispered folklore and half-forgotten regional tales. Yet in certain communities, particularly among black families whose ancestors had lived in the foothills and valleys of northern Alabama, the legend remained powerful. Parents told their children that the mountains once belonged to a man who would not bow, who would not kneel, and who struck fear into those who claimed dominion over others. Some embellished the tales, turning more into something almost supernatural. But even when the stories shifted, the core remained the same, a man who escaped bondage and carved freedom with his own hands. The Great Depression saw a resurgence of interest in oral histories, much of it driven by the Federal Writers Project. Field researchers interviewed elderly African Americans across Alabama, and in those interviews the name Elias Moore appeared more than once. Never exactly the same story, but always the same man. Some called him the Ridge Phantom, others Mountain Eli, others still simply the one who wouldn't bow. One elderly woman, Martha Harlow, aged 91 in 1937, recounted stories her mother told her from childhood. Though bearing the last name of the plantation family, Martha was born into a lineage of enslaved people who had witnessed the brutality of Charles Harlow firsthand. "Mama whispered to us about him," she said. "Said if a master was cruel, that mountain man would know it. Said he came down from the rocks and trees when wickedness crossed a line." She described how, when an overseer disappeared or a cruel master was found dead under strange circumstances, enslaved people would exchange glances but say nothing aloud. Nobody would ask too many questions, she said softly, and nobody cried. The psychological impact of Moore's existence, or even the belief in his existence, cannot be overstated. Plantation records from that era show that in communities near the mountains, overseers often refrained from the harshest punishments. In a chilling letter from 1846, preserved in a private family archive, one plantation owner wrote to his brother in Georgia, "We live under a different sort of rule here. There is a man in the highlands who has appointed himself judge of cruelty. I tread carefully, as do all wise men." But fear was not limited to plantation owners. Slave patrols, which once rode confidently through the valleys and ridges, began avoiding the mountains altogether. One patrolman, Caleb Winters, described how the night became something to dread. "After Murdoch's boys got themselves taken," he wrote many years later, "nobody wanted to search those ridges after dark. Some men claimed it was panthers, others blamed Indians, but the ones of us who saw the signs, we knew it was him." As Reconstruction gave way to Jim Crow, the legend of Elias Moore continued splitting along racial lines. In white communities, he became a monster of the past, an exaggerated tale of a savage lurking in the woods. Some even told stories of him eating men or growing to giant size, attempting to turn him into something inhuman so that fear could be separated from guilt. But even in black communities, Moore transformed into something else, not a monster, not a ghost, but a righteous force that proved bondage did not erase bravery. His story became a whispered lesson in dignity and resistance. By the 1960s, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, scholars and journalists began revisiting these old stories. Some dismissed Moore as pure myth, but others were struck by the consistency across accounts, across generations, across counties, across people who had never met. These independent whispers all pointed to the same man hiding in the mountains, striking only at slave catchers and notorious overseers. It was during this period that researchers discovered the interview with Sarah Doyle, the 97-year-old Tennessee woman who claimed her grandfather had lived alongside Moore in the wilderness. Her account provided rare insight into how Moore had survived, by building alliances, by learning the terrain intimately, by teaching others how to move without leaving trace. Her grandfather described Moore as a man molded by brutality yet refusing to break. Samuel, he never feared death, he said, mistakenly calling him by his former name. He feared cages. That's what he ran from, not men. Cages. Her grandfather reportedly said that Moore believed the mountains themselves had taken him in, that the wind carried messages, that the trees whispered warnings. These were the embellishments of memory, of course, but their emotional truth resonated. The wilderness had not defeated Moore, it had made him powerful. Archaeologists added credibility to the legend when Dr. Ann Carrington led a University of Alabama team to investigate prehistoric Native American sites in the Cumberland Plateau during the 1990s. In a remote overhang, they found remains of a small cabin built into the rock. Carbon dating traced the last signs of habitation to the mid-1840s. The structure showed careful craftsmanship and strategic placement. It overlooked a narrow trail and had been designed to detect anyone approaching from below. Tools and modified weapons were found scattered around the site. Most striking of all was a brass button, identical to those used on clothing issued at the Harlow plantation during Moore's lifetime. Though no definitive proof tied the structure to Moore, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. The team noted that whoever lived there understood not only survival, but tactical advantage. It was, in every sense, the home of a man who expected to be hunted. Even as the world modernized, the myth of the Ridge Phantom retained its grip. Local businesses began capitalizing on the legend, some respectfully, others not. One outfitter offered Ridge Phantom tours, guiding tourists to remote cliffs and caves rumored to be Moore's hiding places. Old-timers scoffed at such commercialization, claiming no tourist would ever be led to the real places, the ones where people swore they felt watched, even under the noon sun. Park rangers in the region occasionally heard strange reports. A hiker saw a shadow moving against the direction of the wind. A hunter heard footsteps pacing him just out of sight. A camper awoke to find footprints circling his tent. Bare footprints, deep and deliberate. Most of these stories were surely products of imagination, but rangers admitted in quiet moments that the mountains were old enough and deep enough to hide things for centuries. If a man knew them well, he could vanish in 10 steps, and you'd never find him unless he wanted you to. Through all these years, the question persisted. Did Elias Moore die in the mountains, become lost to time in Canada, or reinvent himself somewhere no one would think to look? Each possibility carried weight. Each carried truth.
As the 20th century progressed, the story of Elias Moore receded even further into the murky space between legend and lived memory. Industrialization changed the northern Alabama landscape at a pace unimaginable in Moore's era. Logging companies carved roads deep into the once impenetrable forests. Coal and iron mining brought thousands of new laborers into mountain towns. Later, paved highways and state parks made the region accessible in ways the old hunters and trappers would never have believed. Yet for all that change, the mountains still kept their secrets, and the old stories refused to disappear. By the 1930s and 1940s, several families in Jackson and Madison counties preserved private collections of handwritten accounts, faded letters, and oral recollections passed down through generations. These were not formal histories. They lived in the margins, in diaries, in family Bibles, in aging ledgers where space allowed. Nearly all touched on the same theme. During the 1840s, a man named Elias left a trail of fear and justice in the highlands. Some accounts were remarkably detailed. One, recorded by a descendant of a former overseer, claimed that the mere rumor of Moore's return was enough to quiet conflicts. According to that document, young boys dared each other to walk alone near the tree line at dusk. If the wind whistled just right, they swore they heard footsteps. They said Elias was more than a man, the writer noted, though he admitted the stories might have been exaggerated. But if he truly was a man, then he was a man forged in fire. For many white residents, these legends became cautionary tales. Stories about the dangers of the wilderness or about the consequences of crossing moral boundaries. But for black families whose ancestors endured slavery, the tale of Elias Moore was something far deeper, something rooted in identity itself. He was not simply a ghost story. He was a reminder that resistance had existed even in the darkest times, that bravery was possible when every system demanded submission. School integration in the 1950s and 1960s brought a new generation of students into classrooms that now included broader conversations about race, history, and culture. As teachers sought local examples of resilience and injustice, some rediscovered Moore's story. Students wrote essays, a few attempted plays. One teacher collected oral histories from local elders who still remembered fragments of the legend. Mama said he didn't just fight, he saved folks, guided them. He knew every root of every tree, every hiding place the Lord ever made. During the civil rights era, the story took on renewed significance. Activists in Huntsville and Birmingham sometimes invoked Moore symbolically, describing him as an early figure of resistance, an example of someone who refused the role assigned to him by the oppressive system of his time.
Though Moore left no speeches, no pamphlets, no public words, his deeds became a metaphor for standing against injustice even when the law itself provided no protection. Meanwhile, historians, folklorists, and amateur researchers debated the boundaries between fact and myth. Some insisted that Moore's accomplishments were too extraordinary to be fully real. Others argued that the consistency across independent accounts, spread across decades, across families, across racial lines, pointed undeniably to a real person whose actions had been magnified but not invented. Dr. Ann Carrington's archaeological findings in the 1990s added fuel to that discussion. Her discovery of the rock shelter dwelling not only suggested a long-term mountain hideout, but also revealed an intricate understanding of both engineering and stealth. Her excavation report concluded, whoever lived here was highly adaptive, intelligent, and watchful. This is the site of a person who expected pursuit and who used the natural landscape to nullify it. Carrington later expressed frustration that some academics dismissed the possibility that a formerly enslaved man could possess such skill. She wrote, "It reveals prejudice. Survival demands ingenuity, and enslaved people were experts in survival." While scholars disagreed, the region's residents continued to embrace their own interpretations. Some older black residents began holding informal gatherings in the early 2000s to share family stories about the Ridge Phantom. These meetings eventually grew into an annual event. During one such gathering in 2017, historian James Washington addressed the crowd. Whether every detail is accurate or not, Elias Moore represents our heritage of resistance. His life proves that bondage cannot crush the human will to be free. In contrast, many white residents preferred to frame Moore as a dangerous outlaw, a product of violent times, rather than a symbol of justice. Local newspapers occasionally published pieces highlighting the more sensational aspects of the legend: the missing men, the eerie silence in the woods, and the carved warnings left on trees. One columnist argued that Moore should not be romanticized, describing him as a killer hiding behind the cover of wilderness. But others pushed back, pointing out that nearly all of Moore's victims had been slave catchers or notorious abusers. As the debate intensified, tourism boards took notice.
the Scottsboro Museum erected a small exhibit dedicated to the Ridge Phantom, carefully labeling everything as local legend, even when the artifacts hinted strongly at truth. Museum staff admitted privately that the story drew in visitors, hikers, amateur historians, and curious families wanting to hear the darker history of the mountains. The exhibit included maps of the suspected routes Moore used, reproductions of newspaper articles mentioning the sightings, and photos of the excavation site discovered by Carrington's team. Children pointed excitedly at the diagrams of traps Moore allegedly laid for pursuers, while adults lingered over the accounts of plantation owners who lived in fear of a man they could not control. But beyond tourism and folklore, Moore's legacy began influencing something far more noteworthy: academic debates on Black survivalism. Scholars examining Maroon communities, those who built hidden societies within slaveholding territories, started including Moore in their case studies. They compared his tactics to those of Maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp and the Louisiana Bayou. While those communities were larger, Moore's guerrilla-like existence illustrated the extreme end of wilderness resistance. A prominent scholar, Dr. Monica Richardson, argued that Moore represented a hyper-adaptive survivor, someone who not only endured but mastered the environment. She wrote, "He turned the mountains into both shield and sword. He inverted the power dynamic of slavery in a way few dared to attempt." Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of Elias Moore existed not in academic journals or museums, but in the personal reflections of descendants who grew up hearing his name. For them, he symbolized courage, rugged, imperfect, violent, but undeniably courageous. He represented the belief that the oppressed were not merely passive victims, but capable of shaping their own destiny, even when the world denied them the tools to do so. And though the highways grew louder, the forests thinner, and the towns larger, there were still remote valleys in the Cumberland Plateau where the wind curled strangely through the trees, carrying whispers of a man who once melted into these shadows, leaving behind fear, justice, and the faintest imprint of defiance. The mountains remembered him, and in certain homes, certain families, certain hearts, so did the people.
For all the arguments, all the scholarship, all the quiet debates in living rooms and classrooms, perhaps the truest essence of Elias Moore existed in the questions his story refused to answer. What, after all, is the proper way to judge a man forged under bondage? What choices remain when every law, every institution, every sanctioned authority is designed to cage you, break you, or kill you? In many histories of American slavery, the celebrated figures are those who escaped north and later championed abolition: Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth. Their courage, their brilliance, their humanity deserve every honor they receive. But Elias Moore represented another current of resistance, one far more difficult for the nation to comfortably acknowledge: the rebel who refused not just enslavement, but also the terms of engagement set by the society that enslaved him. He did not appeal to their laws, their morality, or their approval. He struck at their power directly, using the wilderness as both battlefield and refuge. For many, this made him uncomfortable to discuss openly. For others, especially descendants of enslaved people, this made him necessary. He was the embodiment of a truth often avoided in sanitized histories. Sometimes oppression leaves no room for gentle resistance. Sometimes the only path left is the one carved with bare hands, sharpened tools, and unyielding will. The ambiguity surrounding Moore's fate allowed his legacy to resist containment. Some residents believed he perished in the mountains, succumbing to the brutal winter of 1847. Others insisted he reached Canada and died peacefully under a different name, buried in a cemetery where no one would ever know the truth of his past. A few swore that he never left Alabama at all, that he found a cave deep enough, a ridge hidden enough, a valley sheltered enough to grow old in solitude. Old hunters in the early 1900s occasionally told stories of a silent, gray-haired man glimpsed at dusk on high ridges, watching with wary eyes before vanishing into the trees. Most likely these were only campfire tales, but the timing, the descriptions, and the whispered tone gave the stories weight. One man claimed he saw the figure sharpening a handmade knife near a creek. Another said he followed tracks barefoot in the snow, tracks too large for a child, too steady for a drunk, too old to belong to any living wanderer. Whatever truth lay behind these stories, the ambiguity gave Moore something rare, a legacy that could not be buried or constrained. He existed in the liminal space between history and folklore, between what could be proven and what must be believed. And in that space he gained a strange kind of immortality. As the 21st century began, the region still carried echoes of him. Hikers often remarked that the deepest parts of the Cumberland Plateau possessed a peculiar quiet, particularly at dusk. Shadows pooled strangely between boulders. Winds whistled through gaps in the cliffs with tones that felt almost like voices. Most dismissed the sensation as imagination, but those who had grown up hearing the stories understood better. One park ranger, interviewed in 2014, recalled escorting a lost hiker out of a remote gully. When he asked what had frightened him, he said softly, "I felt like someone was there. Not an animal, a man, watching to see if I meant harm." The ranger smiled politely and chalked it up to fatigue, but later she admitted, "Those woods can unsettle even seasoned people. Sometimes you do feel someone there, even when you know you're alone." As interest in Black survivalism and resistance grew among scholars, Moore's name reemerged. A new wave of researchers placed him within the tradition of Maroons, individuals who refused to flee northward and instead built hidden, clandestine zones of freedom within slave territory itself. These researchers noted the similarities between Moore's tactics and the guerrilla-style strategies used by Maroon communities in the Great Dismal Swamp. In both cases, the landscape became an ally, a shield, a home. Yet Moore seemed to stand apart even from those comparisons. He was a solitary figure, a lone sentinel whose territory stretched across ridges and ravines.
His solitude made him both more vulnerable and more terrifying. He was a single man who turned the wilderness into a fortress, a single man who shaped an entire region's psychology, a single man who altered behavior among slave patrols, overseers, and plantation owners. Powerful men who seldom admitted fear, yet lived under its weight for years because of him. Historians like Dr. Terence Watson argued that Moore's greatest achievement was the climate of dread he created among those who enforced slavery. Every overseer who hesitated, every patroller who altered his route, every master who moderated his cruelty, Watson wrote, is proof that Moore destabilized the system in ways disproportionate to his lone figure. He cracked the illusion of invincibility that slavery depended on. In the early 2000s, descendants of enslaved people from northern Alabama began holding reunions that included a session dedicated solely to family stories of Moore. At one such gathering, James Washington said what he represents is a refusal to accept bondage, not just escape, but defiance. He didn't vanish into the woods to hide. He vanished to fight. The mountains where Moore once walked changed drastically over the centuries. Vacation cabins now sit where dense forests once pressed against the sky. Trails that only skilled trappers once navigated are now mapped out and graded for tourists. Longing scars mark slopes that were once untouched. And yet, some areas remain stubbornly wild. rugged, shadowed hollows where the sun filters through thick canopies, where streams carve deep channels through ancient rock, where silence settles with an almost sacred heaviness. In those places, hikers sometimes pause, feeling something intangible, the weight of old stories, perhaps, or the recognition that history does not always disappear simply because time tries to bury it. And in those still places, if one believes the old whispers, Elias Moore remains. Maybe not in body, but in memory. In the way the wind curls through narrow ravines, in the instinctive caution that hunters feel near certain cliffs, in the stories parents still pass to children when the fire burns low. His journal, recovered from an abandoned encampment, offered perhaps the closest thing to his own voice, and it is his final recorded words that capture the heart of what he became. They made me property, but these mountains made me a man. They made me invisible, but here I learned to see in darkness. They tried to break my spirit, but instead forged something they could never command. I am what they created, turned back upon its creators. Let history remember this truth. That passage, preserved through time, stands as the final testament of the slave who escaped and became the most feared mountain man in the South, a man who refused to be erased, a man who claimed the wilderness as his home, his refuge, and his weapon. I came to these mountains a fugitive, running from what I was told I must be. I leave them a man certain of who I truly am. Whatever awaits me beyond these ridges, I carry this truth within me, as immovable as the mountains themselves. I was born a slave, but I will die free in body and spirit. Let those who come after know it can be. And in countless small communities scattered across northern Alabama, among the descendants of those who once whispered about him in the dead of night, they do.